On a Chinese screen, Somerset Maugham, Part 4, 23, God's Truth. Birch was the agent of the BAT, and he was stationed in a little town of the interior with streets which, after it had rained, were a foot deep in mud. Then you had to get right inside your cart to prevent yourself from being splashed from head to foot. The roadway, worn to pieces by the ceaseless traffic, was so full of holes that the breath was jolted out of your body as you jogged along at a foot pace. There were 2 or 3 streets of shops, but he knew by heart everything that was in them, and there were interminable winding alleys which presented a monotonous expanse of wall broken only by solid closed doors. These were the Chinese houses, and they were as impenetrable to one of his color as the life which surrounded him. He was very homesick. He had not spoken to a white man for 3 months. His day's work was over. Since he had nothing else to do, he went for the only walk there was. He went out of the city gate and strolled along the ragged road, with its deep ruts, into the country. The valley was bounded by wild, barren mountains, and they seemed to shut him in. He felt immeasurably far away from civilization. He knew he could not afford to surrender to that sense of utter loneliness which beset him, but it was more of an effort than usual to keep a stiff upper lip. He was very nearly at the end of his tether. Suddenly, he saw a white man riding towards him on a pony. Behind came slowly a Chinese cart in which presumably were his belongings. Birch guessed at once that this was a missionary going down to one of the treaty ports from his station further up country, and his heart leaped with joy. At last he would have someone to talk to. He hurried his steps. His lassitude left him. He was all alert. He was almost running when he came up to the rider. "Hello," he said. "Where have you sprung from?" The rider stopped and named a distant town. "I'm on my way down to take the train," he added. "You'd better put up with me for the night. I haven't seen a white man for 3 months. There's lots of room at my place. Bat, you know." "BT," said the rider. His face changed, and his eyes, before friendly and smiling, grew hard. "I don't want to have anything to do with you." He gave his pony a kick and started on, but Birch seized the bridle. He could not believe his ears. "What do you mean? I can't have anything to do with a man who trades in tobacco. Let go that bridle." "But I've not spoken to a white man for 3 months." "That's no business of mine. Let go that bridle." He gave his pony another kick. His lips were obstinately set, and he looked at Birch sternly. Then Birch lost his temper. He clung to the bridle as the pony moved on and began to curse the missionary. He hurled at him every term of abuse he could think of. He swore. He was horribly obscene. The missionary did not answer, but urged his pony on. Birch seized the missionary's leg and jerked it out of the stirrup. The missionary nearly fell off, and he clung in a somewhat undignified fashion to the pony's mane. Then he half slipped, half tumbled to the ground. The cart had come up to them by now and stopped. The 2 Chinese who were sitting in it looked at the white men with indolent curiosity. The missionary was livid with rage. "You've assaulted me. I'll have you fired for that." "You can go to hell," said Birch. "I haven't seen a white man for 3 months, and you won't even speak to me. Do you call yourself a Christian?" "What is your name?" "Birch is my name, and be damned to you." "I shall report you to your chief. Now stand back and let me get on my journey." Birch clenched his hands. "Get a move on, or I'll break every bone in your body." The missionary mounted, gave his pony a sharp cut with the whip, and cantered away. The Chinese cart lumbered slowly after, but when Birch was left alone, his anger left him, and a sob broke unwillingly from his lips. The barren mountains were less hard than the heart of man. He turned and walked slowly back to the little walled city. 24. Romance. All day I had been dropping down the river. This was the river up which Chang Chien, seeking its source, had sailed for many days till he came to a city where he saw a girl spinning and a youth leading an ox to the water. He asked what place this was, and in reply the girl gave him her shuttle, telling him to show it on his return to the astrologer Yen Chun Ping, who would thus know where he had been. He did so, and the astrologer at once recognized the shuttle as that of the spinning damsel, further declaring that on the day and at the hour when Chang Chien received the shuttle, he had noticed a wandering star intrude itself between the spinning damsel and the cowherd. So Chang Chien knew that he had sailed upon the bosom of the Milky Way. I, however, had not been so far. All day, as for 7 days before, my 5 rowers standing up had rowed, and there rang still in my ears the monotonous sound of their oars against the wooden pin that served as rowlock. Now and again the water became very shallow, and there was a jar and a jolt as we scraped along the stones of the riverbed. Then 2 or 3 of the rowers turned up their blue trousers to the hip and let themselves over the side. Shouting, they dragged the flat-bottomed boat over the shoal. Now and again we came to a rapid of no great consequence when compared with the turbulent rapids of the Yangtze, but sufficiently swift to call for trackers to pull the junks that were going upstream. And we, going down, passed through them with many shouts, shot the foaming breakers, and presently reached water as smooth as any lake. Now it was night, and my crew were asleep, forward, huddled together in such shelter as they had been able to rig up when we moored at dusk. I sat on my bed. Bamboo matting spread over 3 wooden arches made the sorry cabin, which for a week had served me as parlour and bedroom. It was closed at one end by matchboarding so roughly put together that there were large chinks between each board. The bitter wind blew through them. It was on the other side of this that the crew, fine, sturdy fellows, rowed by day and slept by night, joined then by the steersman, who had stood from dawn to dusk in a tattered blue gown and a wadded coat of faded grey, a black turban round his head at the long oar which was his helm. There was no furniture but my bed, a shallow dish like an enormous soup plate in which burned charcoal. For it was cold, a basket containing my clothes which I used as a table, and a hurricane lamp which hung from one of the arches and swayed slightly with the motion of the water. The cabin was so low that I, a person of no great height, I comfort myself with Bacon's observation that with tall men it is as with tall houses, the top story is commonly the least furnished, could only just stand upright. One of the sleepers began to snore more loudly, and perhaps he awoke 2 of the others, for I heard the sound of speaking. But presently this ceased, the snorer was quiet, and all about me once more was silence. Then suddenly I had a feeling that here, facing me, touching me almost, was the romance I sought. It was a feeling like no other, just as specific as the thrill of art. But I could not for the life of me tell what it was that had given me just then that rare emotion. In the course of my life I have been often in situations which, had I read of them, would have seemed to me sufficiently romantic. But it is only in retrospect, comparing them with my ideas of what was romantic, that I have seen them as at all out of the ordinary. It is only by an effort of the imagination, making myself as it were a spectator of myself acting a part, that I have caught anything of the precious quality in circumstances which in others would have seemed to me instinct with its fine flower. When I have danced with an actress whose fascination and whose genius made her the idol of my country, or wandered through the halls of some great house in which was gathered all that was distinguished by lineage or intellect that London could show, I have only recognized afterwards that here perhaps, though in somewhat Ouidaesque a fashion, was romance. In battle, when myself in no great danger, I was able to watch events with a thrill of interest. I had not the phlegm to assume the part of a spectator. I have sailed through the night, under the full moon, to a coral island in the Pacific, and then the beauty and the wonder of the scene gave me a conscious happiness, but only later the exhilarating sense that romance and I had touched fingers. I heard the flutter of its wings when once, in the bedroom of a hotel in New York, I sat round a table with half a dozen others and made plans to restore an ancient kingdom whose wrongs have for a century inspired the poet and the patriot. But my chief feeling was a surprised amusement that through the hazards of war I found myself engaged in business so foreign to my bent. The authentic thrill of romance has seized me under circumstances which one would have thought far less romantic, and I remember that I knew it first one evening when I was playing cards in a cottage on the coast of Brittany. In the next room, an old fisherman lay dying, and the women of the house said that he would go out with the tide. Without a storm was raging, and it seemed fit for the last moments of that aged warrior of the seas that his going should be accompanied by the wild cries of the wind as it hurled itself against the shuttered windows. The waves thundered upon the tortured rocks. I felt a sudden exultation, for I knew that here was romance. And now the same exultation seized me, and once more romance, like a bodily presence, was before me. But it had come so unexpectedly that I was intrigued. I could not tell whether it had crept in among the shadows that the lamp threw on the bamboo matting, or whether it was wafted down the river that I saw through the opening of my cabin. Curious to know what were the elements that made up the ineffable delight of the moment I went out to the stern of the boat. Alongside were moored half a dozen junks going up river, for their masts were erect, and everything was silent in them. Their crews were long since asleep. The night was not dark, for though it was cloudy, the moon was full, but the river in that veiled light was ghostly. A vague mist blurred the trees on the further bank. It was an enchanting sight, but there was in it nothing unaccustomed, and what I sought was not there. I turned away. But when I returned to my bamboo shelter, the magic which had given it so extraordinary a character was gone. Alas, I was like a man who should tear a butterfly to pieces in order to discover in what its beauty lay. And yet, as Moses descending from Mount Sinai wore on his face a brightness from his converse with the God of Israel, my little cabin, my dish of charcoal, my lamp, even my camp bed, had still about them something of the thrill which for a moment was mine. I could not see them any more quite indifferently, because for a moment I had seen them magically. 25. The Grand Style. He was a very old man. It was 57 years since he came to China as a ship's doctor and took the place in one of the southern ports of a medical officer whose health had obliged him to go home. He could not then have been less than 25, so that now he must have been well over 80. He was a tall man, very thin, and his skin hung on his bones like a suit of clothes, much too large for him. Under his chin was a great sack like the wattle of an old turkey cock. But his blue eyes, large and bright, had kept their colour, and his voice was strong and deep. In these 57 years he had bought and sold 3 or 4 practices along the coast, and now he was back once more within a few miles of the port in which he had first lived. It was an anchorage at the mouth of the river where the steamers, unable owing to their draught to reach the city, discharged and loaded their cargo. There were only 7 white men's houses, a small hospital, and a handful of Chinese, so that it would not have been worth a doctor's while to settle there. But he was vice-consul as well, and the easy life at his great age just suited him. There was enough to do to prevent him from feeling idle, but not enough to tire him. His spirit was still hale. "I'm thinking of retiring," he said. "It's about time I gave the youngsters a chance." He amused himself with plans for the future. All his life he had wanted to visit the West Indies, and upon his soul he meant to now. By George, sir, he couldn't afford to leave it much longer. England? Well, from all he heard, England was no place for a gentleman nowadays. He was last there 30 years ago. Besides, he wasn't English. He was born in Ireland. Yes, sir, he took his degree at Trinity College, Dublin. But what with the priests on one side and the Sinn Feiners on the other, he could not believe there was much left of the Ireland he knew as a boy. A fine country to hunt in, he said, with a gleam in his open blue eyes. Now, he had better manners than are usually found in the medical profession, which, though blessed with many virtues, neglects somewhat the amenities of polite behaviour. I do not know whether it is commerce with the sick, which gives the doctor an unfortunate sense of superiority. The example of his teachers, some of whom have still a bad tradition of rudeness, which certain eminent practitioners of the past cultivated as a professional asset, or his early training among the poor patients of a hospital whom he is apt to look upon as of a lower class than himself. But it is certain that no body of men is on the whole so wanting in civility. He was very different from the men of my generation, but whether the difference lay in his voice and gesture, in the ease of his manner, or in the elaborateness of his antique courtesy, it was not easy to discover. I think he was more definitely a gentleman than people are nowadays when a man is a gentleman with deprecation. The word is in bad odour, and the qualities it denotes have come in for a deal of ridicule. Persons who by no stretch of the fancy could be so described have made a great stir in the world during the last 30 years, and they have used all the resources of their sarcasm to render odious a title which they are perhaps all too conscious of never deserving. Perhaps also the difference in him was due to a difference of education. In his youth he had been taught much useless learning, the classics of Greece and Rome, and they had given a foundation to his character which in the present is somewhat rare. He was young in an age which did not know the weekly press, and when the monthly magazine was a staid affair. Reading was more solid. Perhaps men drank more than was good for them, but they read Horace for pleasure, and they knew by heart the novels of Sir Walter Scott. He remembered reading the Newcomes when it came out. I think the men of that time were, if not more adventurous than the men of ours, more adventurous in the grand manner. Now, a man will risk his life with a joke from comic cuts on his lips than it was with a Latin quotation. But how can I analyze the subtle quality which distinguished this old man? Read a page of Swift. The words are the same as those we use today, and there is hardly a sentence in which they are not placed in the simplest order. And yet there is a dignity, a spaciousness, an aroma, which all our modern effort fails to attain. In short, there is style. And so with him, there was style, and there is no more to be said. 26. Rain. Yes, but the sun does not shine every day. Sometimes a cold rain beats down on you, and a northeast wind chills you to the bone. Your shoes and your coat are wet still from the day before, and you have 3 hours to go before breakfast. You tramp along in the cheerless light of that bitter dawn, with 30 miles before you, and nothing to look forward to at the end but the squalid discomfort of a Chinese inn. There you will find bare walls, a clammy floor of trodden earth, and you will dry yourself as best you can over a dish of burning charcoal. Then you think of your pleasant room in London. The rain driving in squalls against the windows only makes its warmth more grateful. You sit by the fire, your pipe in your mouth, and read the Times from cover to cover. Not the leading articles, of course, but the agony column and the advertisements of country houses you will never be able to afford. On the Chiltern Hills, standing in its own park of 150 acres, with spacious garden, orchard, etc., a Georgian house in perfect condition, with original woodwork and chimney pieces, 6 reception rooms, 14 bedrooms and usual offices, modern sanitation, stabling with rooms over, and excellent garage. 3 miles from first-rate golf course. I know then that Messrs. Knight, Frank, and Rutley are my favourite authors. The matters that they treat of, like the great commonplaces, which are the material of all fine poetry, never stale, and their manner, like that of the best masters, is characteristic but at the same time various. Their style, as is that of Confucius according to the sinologues, is glitteringly compact, succinct but suggestive. It combines an admirable exactness with a breadth of image which gives the imagination an agreeable freedom. Their mastery of words such as rude and perch, of which I suppose I once knew the meaning, but which for many years have been a mystery to me, is amazing, and they will use them with ease and assurance. They can play with technical terms with the ingenuity of Mr. Rudyard Kipling, and they can invest them with the Celtic glamour of Mr. W.W.B. Yeats. They have combined their individualities so completely that I defy the most discerning critic to discover traces of a divided authorship. Literary history is acquainted with the collaboration of 2 writers, and the names of Beaumont and Fletcher, Erckman Chatrian, Besant and Rice spring to the excited fancy. But now that the higher criticism has destroyed that belief in the triple authorship of the Bible, which I was taught in my youth, I conjecture that the case of Knight, Frank, and Rutley is unique. Then Elizabeth, very smart in the white squirrel I brought her from China, comes in to say goodbye to me, for she, poor child, must go out whatever the weather, and I play trains with her while her pram is being got ready. Then, of course, I should do a little work, but the weather is so bad that I feel lazy, and I take up instead Professor Giles's book on Chuang Tzu. The rigid Confucianists frown upon him because he is an individualist, and it is to the individualism of the age that they ascribe the lamentable decay of China, but he is very good reading. He has the advantage on a rainy day that he can be read without great application, and not seldom you come across a thought that sets your own wandering. But presently ideas, insinuating themselves into your consciousness like the lapping waves of a rising tide, absorb you to the exclusion of those which old Chuang Tzu suggested, and notwithstanding your desire to idle, you sit down at your table. Only the dilettante uses a desk. Your pen goes easily, and you write without effort. It is very good to be alive. Then 2 amusing people come to luncheon, and when they are gone, you drop into Christie's. You see some Ming figures there, but they are not so good as those you brought from China yourself, and then you watch being sold pictures you are only too glad not to possess. You look at your watch. There is pretty sure to be a rubber going at the Garrick, and the shocking weather justifies you in wasting the rest of the afternoon. You cannot stay very late, for you have seats for a first night, and you must get home and dress for an early dinner. You will be just in time to tell Elizabeth a little story before she goes to sleep. She looks really very nice in her pajamas, with her hair done up in 2 plaits. There is something about a first night which only the satiety of the critic can fail to be moved by. It is pleasant to see your friends and amusing to hear the pit's applause when a favourite of the stage, acting better than she ever does behind the footlights, a delightful embarrassment at being recognized, advances to take her seat. It may be a bad play that you're going to see, but it has at least the merit that no one has seen it before, and there is always the chance of a moment's emotion or of a smile. Towards you in their great straw hats, like the hat of lovesick Pierrot, but with a huge brim, come a string of coolies, lolloping along, bent forward a little under the weight of the great bales of cotton that they carry. The rain plasters their blue clothes, so thin and ragged, against their bodies. The broken stones of the causeway are slippery, and with toil you pick your muddy way. 27. Sullivan. He was an Irish sailor. He deserted his ship at Hong Kong and took it into his head to walk across China. He spent 3 years wandering about the country and soon acquired a very good knowledge of Chinese. He learned it as is common among men of his class, with greater ease than do the more highly educated. He lived on his wits. He made a point of avoiding the British consul, but went to the magistrate of each town he came to and represented himself as having been robbed on the way of all his money. His story was not improbable, and it was told with a wealth of convincing detail which would have excited the admiration of so great a master as Captain Costigan. The magistrate, after the Chinese fashion, was anxious to get rid of him and was glad to do so at the cost of $10 or $15. If he could get no money, he could generally count on a place to sleep in and a good meal. He had a certain rough humor which appealed to the Chinese. So he continued very successfully till he hit by misfortune on a magistrate of a different stamp. This man, when he told his story, said to him, "You are nothing but a beggar and a vagabond. You must be beaten." He gave an order, and the fellow was promptly taken out, thrown on the ground, and soundly thrashed. He was not only very much hurt, but exceedingly surprised, and what is more strangely mortified. It ruined his nerve. There and then he gave up his vagrant life, and making his way to one of the outports, applied to the Commissioner of Customs for a place as tide waiter. It is not easy to find white men to take such posts, and few questions are asked of those who seek them. He was given a job, and you may see him now, a sunburned, clean-shaven man of 45, florid and rather stout, in a neat blue uniform, boarding the steamers and the junks at a little riverside town, where the deputy commissioner, the postmaster, a missionary, and he are the only Europeans. His knowledge of the Chinese and their ways makes him an invaluable servant. He has a little yellow wife and 4 children. He has no shame about his past, and over a good stiff whiskey he will tell you the whole story of his adventurous travels. But the beating is what he can never get over. It surprises him yet, and he simply cannot understand it. He has no ill feeling towards the magistrate who ordered it. On the contrary, it appeals to his sense of humor. "He was a great old sportsman, the old blackguard," he says. Nerve, eh? 28. The dining room. It was an immense room in an immense house. When it was built, building was cheap, and the merchant princes of that day built magnificently. Money was made easily then, and life was luxurious. It was not hard to make a fortune, and a man, almost before he had reached middle age, could return to England and live the rest of his days no less splendidly in a fine house in Surrey. It is true that the population was hostile, and it was always possible that a riot might make it necessary for him to fly for his life, but this only added a spice to the comfort of his existence. And when danger threatened, it was fairly certain that a gunboat would arrive in time to offer protection or refuge. The foreign community, largely allied by marriage, was sociable, and its members entertained one another lavishly. They gave pompous dinner parties, they danced together, and they played whist. Work was not so pressing that it was impossible to spend now and again a few days in the interior shooting duck. It was certainly very hot in summer, and after a few years a man was apt to take things easily, but the rest of the year was only warm, with blue skies and a balmy air, and life was very pleasant. There was a certain liberty of behavior, and no one was thought the worse of, so long as the matter was not intruded on the notice of the ladies, if he had to live with him a little bright-eyed Chinese girl. When he married, he sent her away with a present, and if there were children, they were provided for at a Eurasian school in Shanghai. But this agreeable life was a thing of the past. The port lived on its export of tea, and the change of taste from Chinese to Ceylon had ruined it. For 30 years the port had lain a-dying. Before that, the consul had had 2 vice-consuls to help him in his work, but now he was able to do it easily by himself. He generally managed to get a game of golf in the afternoon, and he was seldom too busy for a rubber of bridge. Nothing remained of the old splendor but the enormous hongs, and they were mostly empty. The tea merchants, such as were left of them, turned their hands to all manner of sidelines in the effort to make both ends meet. but the effort was listless. Everyone in the port seemed old. It was no place for a young man. And in the room in which I sat, I seemed to read the history of the past and the history of the man I was awaiting. It was Sunday morning, and when I arrived after 2 days on a coasting steamer, he was in church. I tried to construct a portrait of him from the room. There was something pathetic about it. It had the magnificence of a past generation, but a magnificence run to seed, and its tidiness, I know not why, seemed to emphasize a shamefaced poverty. On the floor was a huge Turkey carpet, which in the 70s must have cost a great deal of money, but now it was quite threadbare. The immense mahogany table, at which so many good dinners had been eaten with such a luxury of wine, was so highly polished that you could see your face in it. It suggested port, old and tawny and prosperous, red-faced gentlemen with side whiskers discussing the antics of the mountebank Disraeli. The walls were of that sombre red, which was thought suitable for a dining room when dinner was a respectable function, and they were heavy with pictures. Here were the father and mother of my host, an elderly gentleman with grey whiskers and a bald head, and a stern, dark old lady with her hair dressed in the fashion of the Empress Eugenie, and there his grandfather in a stock and his grandmother in a mob cap. The mahogany sideboard with a mirror at the back was laden with plated salvers and a tea service and much else, while in the middle of the dining table stood an immense epergne. On the black marble chimney-piece was a black marble clock, flanked by black marble vases, and in the four corners of the room were cabinets filled with all manner of plated articles. Here and there great palms in pots spread their stiff foliage. The chairs were of massive mahogany, stuffed and covered with faded red leather, and on each side of the fireplace was an armchair. The room, large though it was, seemed crowded, but because everything was rather shabby, it gave you an impression of melancholy. All those things seemed to have a sad life of their own, but a life subdued, as though the force of circumstances had proved too much for them. They had no longer the strength to struggle against fate, but they clung together with a tremulous eagerness as though they had a vague feeling that only so could they retain their significance, and I felt that it was only a little time before the end came when they would lie haphazard, in an unlovely confusion, with little numbers pasted on them in the dreary coldness of an auction room. 29. Arabesque. There in the mist, enormous, majestic, silent and terrible, stood the Great Wall of China. Solitarily, with the indifference of nature herself, it crept up the mountainside and slipped down to the depth of the valley. Menacingly, the grim watchtowers, stark and foursquare, at due intervals stood at their posts. Ruthlessly, for it was built at the cost of 1,000,000 lives, and each one of those great grey stones has been stained with the bloody tears of the captive and the outcast, it forged its dark way through a sea of rugged mountains. Fearlessly, it went on its endless journey, league upon league, to the furthermost regions of Asia, in utter solitude, mysterious like the great empire it guarded. There in the mist, enormous, majestic, silent, and terrible, stood the Great Wall of China. 30. The Consul. Mr. Pete was in a state of the liveliest exasperation. He had been in the consular service for more than 20 years, and he had had to deal with all manner of vexatious people, officials who would not listen to reason, merchants who took the British government for a debt-collecting agency, missionaries who resented as gross injustice any attempt at fair play. But he never recollected a case which had left him more completely at a loss. He was a mild-mannered man, but for no reason he flew into a passion with his writer, and he very nearly sacked the Eurasian clerk because he had wrongly spelt 2 words in a letter placed before him for his official signature. He was a conscientious man, and he could not persuade himself to leave his office before the clock struck 4. but the moment it did, he jumped up and called for his hat and stick. Because his boy did not bring them at once, he abused him roundly. They say that the consuls all grow a little odd, and the merchants who can live for 35 years in China without learning enough of the language to ask their way in the street say that it is because they have to study Chinese, and there was no doubt that Mr. Pete was decidedly odd. He was a bachelor, and on that account had been sent to a series of posts which, by reason of their isolation, were thought unsuited to married men. He had lived so much alone that his natural tendency to eccentricity had developed to an extravagant degree, and he had habits which surprised the stranger. He was very absent-minded. He paid no attention to his house, which was always in great disorder, nor to his food. His boys gave him to eat what they liked, and for everything he had made him pay through the nose. He was untiring in his efforts to suppress the opium traffic, but he was the only person in the city who did not know that his servants kept opium in the consulate itself, and a busy traffic in the drug was openly conducted at the back door of the compound. He was an ardent collector, and the house provided for him by the government was filled with the various things which he had collected one after the other: pewter, brass, carved wood. These were his more legitimate enterprises, but he also collected stamps, birds' eggs, hotel labels, and postmarks. He boasted that he had a collection of postmarks which was unequaled in the empire. During his long sojourning in lonely places, he had read a great deal, and though he was no sinologue, he had a greater knowledge of China, its history, literature, and people than most of his colleagues. But from his wide reading, he had acquired not toleration, but vanity. He was a man of a singular appearance. His body was small and frail, and when he walked, he gave you the idea of a dead leaf dancing before the wind. And then there was something extraordinarily odd in the small Tyrolese hat, with a cock's feather in it, very old and shabby, which he wore perched rakishly on the side of his large head. He was exceedingly bald. You saw that his eyes, blue and pale, were weak behind the spectacles, and a drooping, ragged, dingy moustache did not hide the peevishness of his mouth. And now, turning out of the street in which was the consulate, he made his way onto the city wall, for there, only in the multitudinous city, was it possible to walk with comfort. He was a man who took his work hardly, worrying himself to death over every trifle, but as a rule, a walk on the wall soothed and rested him. The city stood in the midst of a great plain, and often at sundown from the wall you could see in the distance the snow-capped mountains, the mountains of Tibet. But now he walked quickly, looking neither to the right nor to the left, and his fat spaniel frisked about him unobserved. He talked to himself rapidly in a low monotone. The cause of his irritation was a visit that he had that day received from a lady who called herself Mrs. Yu, and whom he, with a consular passion for precision, insisted on calling Miss Lambert. This in itself sufficed to deprive their intercourse of amenity. She was an Englishwoman married to a Chinese. She had arrived 2 years before with her husband from England, where he had been studying at the University of London. He had made her believe that he was a great personage in his own country, and she had imagined herself to be coming to a gorgeous palace and a position of consequence. It was a bitter surprise when she found herself brought to a shabby Chinese house crowded with people. There was not even a foreign bed in it, nor a knife and fork. Everything seemed to her very dirty and smelly. It was a shock to find that she had to live with her husband's father and mother, and he told her that she must do exactly what his mother bade her. But in her complete ignorance of Chinese, it was not till she had been 2 or 3 days in the house that she realized that she was not her husband's only wife. He had been married as a boy before he left his native city to acquire the knowledge of the barbarians. When she bitterly upbraided him for deceiving her, he shrugged his shoulders. There was nothing to prevent a Chinese from having two wives if he wanted them, and he added with some disregard to truth, no Chinese woman looked upon it as a hardship. It was upon making this discovery that she paid her first visit to the consul. He had already heard of her arrival. In China, everyone knows everything about everyone, and he received her without surprise. Nor had he much sympathy to show her. That a foreign woman should marry a Chinese at all filled him with indignation, but that she should do so without making proper inquiries vexed him like a personal affront. She was not at all the sort of woman whose appearance led you to imagine that she would be guilty of such a folly. She was a solid, thick-set young person, short, plain, and matter-of-fact. She was cheaply dressed in a tailor-made suit, and she wore a tam-o'-shanter. She had bad teeth and a muddy skin. Her hands were large and red and ill cared for. You could tell that she was not unused to hard work. She spoke English with a Cockney whine. "How did you meet Mr. Yu?" asked the consul frigidly. "Well, you see, it's like this," she answered. "Dad was in a very good position, and when he died, Mother said, 'Well, it seems a sinful waste to keep all these rooms empty. I'll put a card in the window.'" The consul interrupted her. "He had lodgings with you?" "Well, they weren't exactly lodgings," she said. "Shall we say apartments, then?" replied the consul with his thin, slightly vain smile. That was generally the explanation of these marriages. Then, because he thought her a very foolish, vulgar woman, he explained bluntly that according to English law she was not married to you, and that the best thing she could do was to go back to England at once. She began to cry, and his heart softened a little to her. He promised to put her in charge of some missionary ladies who would look after her on the long journey, and indeed, if she liked, he would see if meanwhile she could not live in one of the missions. But while he talked, Miss Lambert dried her tears. "What's the good of going back to England?" she said at last. "I haven't got nowhere to go to." "You can go to your mother." "She was all against my marrying Mr. Yu. I should never hear the last of it if I was to go back now." The consul began to argue with her, but the more he argued, the more determined she became, and at last he lost his temper. "If you like to stay here with a man who isn't your husband, it's your own lookout, but I wash my hands of all responsibility." Her retort had often rankled. "Then you've got no cause to worry," she said, and the look on her face returned to him whenever he thought of her. That was 2 years ago, and he had seen her once or twice since then. It appeared that she got on very badly, both with her mother-in-law and with her husband's other wife, and she had come to the consul with preposterous questions about her rights according to Chinese law. He repeated his offer to get her away, but she remained steadfast in her refusal to go, and their interview always ended in the consul's flying into a passion. He was almost inclined to pity the rascally Yu, who had to keep the peace between 3 warring women. According to his English wife's account, he was not unkind to her. He tried to act fairly by both his wives. Miss Lambert did not improve. The consul knew that ordinarily she wore Chinese clothes, but when she came to see him, she put on European dress. She was become extremely blousy. Her health suffered from the Chinese food she ate, and she was beginning to look wretchedly ill. But really he was shocked when she had been shown into his office that day. She wore no hat, and her hair was disheveled. She was in a highly hysterical state. "They're trying to poison me," she screamed, and she put before him a bowl of some foul-smelling food. "It's poisoned," she said. "I've been ill for the last 10 days. It's only by a miracle I've escaped." She gave him a long story, circumstantial and probable enough to convince him. After all, nothing was more likely than that the Chinese women should use familiar methods to get rid of an intruder who was hateful to them. "Do they know you've come here?" "Of course they do. I told them I was going to show them up." Now, at last, was the moment for decisive action. The consul looked at her in his most official manner. "Well, you must never go back there. I refuse to put up with your nonsense any longer. I insist on your leaving this man who isn't your husband." But he found himself helpless against the woman's insane obstinacy. He repeated all the arguments he had used so often, but she would not listen, and as usual, he lost his temper. It was then, in answer to his final desperate question, that she had made the remark which had entirely robbed him of his calm. "But what on earth makes you stay with the man?" he cried. She hesitated for a moment, and a curious look came into her eyes. "There's something in the way his hair grows on his forehead that I can't help liking," she answered. The consul had never heard anything so outrageous. It really was the last straw. And now, while he strode along, trying to walk off his anger, though he was not a man who often used bad language, he really could not restrain himself, and he said fiercely, "Women are simply bloody."